Hello everyone and welcome back to another Giant Slayer TFT Top 10 video. Today we'll be going over 10 items you should consider using in patch 10.13. We'll break down why each item may have a place in the new meta alongside items that were strong in 10.12 that carry over into the new patch. With that said, let's get into it. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright folks, let's get back into the video. As mentioned, these items are either top items returning from the last patch that are still good to use, or they're new items to consider trying out. First up at number 10 on the list, we have Hextech Gunblade. Hextech as well as Bloodthirster have not really found a place yet in set 3. That may change though, as both recently got buffed to 45% healing in 10.13. While Bloodthirster may find a home among attack damage champions, we want to talk about Hextech Gunblade instead. The meta shifted heavily into magic damage near the end of 10.12, and so far it's still true in 10.13. There are several carries that rely on physical damage, but quite a few use magic damage as well. Hextech will only heal spell damage, so make sure you're using it on champions that primarily do that type of damage. In regards to why this item is worth trying out, there's a few champions to highlight that may use it well. Riven, Victor, Aurelion Sol, and the Super Mech may all find use for Gunblade, as they can do a lot of damage with their abilities. Aurelion is the only one that would be a slower heal over time, but the other three may find use from the healing, as their abilities, when they go off properly, can do a lot of damage and thus heal for a lot. All in all, Hextech Gunblade may not become a staple item of the meta, but it may find its place by being a situationally useful item for a few champions. Moving along, let's talk about Guardian Angel as the number 9 item on the list. Of course, Guardian Angel will be on the list. It has been a cornerstone of the meta for basically every single patch of every single set. So that does mean we don't need to say much to sell you on this item, but there's a few things to consider. First is that despite being a great mid to late game item, it may not be worth slamming an early Guardian Angel anymore. This was already becoming a true statement in 10.12, and that philosophy has carried over to 10.13. With Sword being such a contested component, it isn't always worth it to immediately make GA. Even Chain Vest has other items to consider first in the early game before GA. The second thing to think about with Guardian Angel is that it has a late game counter, Urgot. Urgot can pull and kill in any champion even through GA, so it's imperative you try to position around him in the late game if you're running Guardian Angel. Overall, GA is still a great item and will have a lot of uses, but make sure you weigh other choices prior to making it. Time for the next item on the list, coming in at number 8, Static Shiv. Static Shiv has had a tumultuous existence in TFT so far. There's been metas where it's strong and a lot where it hasn't been used at all. Shiv did have a place in set 3 for a little bit in the build Pikachu with Zaya, and occasionally you'd see a Kale or Echo use it, but overall it hasn't really found its stride yet. But in 10.13 it did receive a damage buff going up to 90 from 80. While that isn't a huge amount later on in the game, it is a decent chunk of damage early on. That's where we think this item may shine in 10.13 as a potential item you can slam early on to aim for a win streak. Any early game item carry can use it, but it's also worth considering placing on a Battlecast champion like Kog'Maw, as both he and the trait got buffed this patch. So if you're looking for an advantage in the early game, try making Static Shiv, especially if you're running Battlecast. Next up, we've got Ionic Spark as the number 7 item. Ionic Spark is another item returning from the previous meta that should remain strong in 10.13. It mainly rose up in viability because Vanguard Mystic, but even with that composition not being as popular, the value you get from Ionic Spark is still great. Early game, it's easily one of the best, if not the best items to make, because it can be played on practically every single composition. That means you can slam it early and it doesn't automatically dictate what direction you have to go with your build later on. That said, it does benefit the most from any composition that leans more towards magic damage. That's why in the early game you can easily play it on a frontline champion and have your early game carry be Ziggs, Ahri, or Twisted Fate. The bottom line is Ionic Spark is a fantastic item throughout the game regardless of your comp. ZZ Rod is next on the list, coming in at number 6. ZZ Rod Portal is not necessarily a new item in the meta, as it's always had somewhat of a place as an early game item or just something to make for your frontline later on. But it has really been prioritized recently, and that's where the balance changes in 10.13 slide on in. It received a significant buff to the health of the construct, as it's now 1500 2250, which is up from its previous 1000 2000. Later on in the game, it's still mostly a throwaway item for your frontline, but early on, it has an insanely high amount amount of value. On a 1-star champion, you suddenly get an extra 1500 health added to your frontline when the champion dies, which is an absurd amount. Basically, ZZ Rot may now be an item you can prioritize early game as a means to win streak with. It may lose some value later on, but as far as the early game is considered, it's still going to get a lot of value. It's getting a bit chilly in here with the item coming in at number 5, Frozen Heart. We all know Frozen Heart can be a valuable item, right? It's not something you prioritize making, but hey, when you've got a spare chain vest in a tier, you can make this item and get a good amount of value. So why is it worth considering even more now in 1013? Well, the big reason is that infiltrators may be more popular in 1013 than they have been previously. With buffs for them in the patch, we may see some more infiltrator compositions pop up in the meta, and those champions by far are the best to give a Frozen Heart to. But another important reason is that Jinx got nerfed. Jinx became one of the strongest 4-cost carries at the end of 1012 and has been doing well in 1013. Her ultimate did get nerfed though, as the attack speed increase went down to 50-70% from 60-75%. It doesn't look like much, but it is a decent hit to her attack speed after she gets a reset. That's why Frozen Heart will be better now into her, as she can't overcome the slowing effect as easily now when she gets attack speed from her first kill. And of course, Frozen Heart is also good against any backline carries, which makes it a solid choice on certain champions like Gnar and Vi, or as mentioned, infiltrators. Up next, we have Jeweled Gauntlet coming in as the number 4 item on the list. Overall, Jeweled Gauntlet hasn't been getting a lot of value despite there being a lot of ability power champions. Occasionally you'd see it on a Syndra back when Star Guardian Sorcerer was popular, or even once in a blue moon on Darius and Space Jam, but it really has never been a core item. In 1013 though, it did get a buff, as the bonus critical damage it provides is now up to 30% from 20%. Maybe not the biggest increase, but certainly enough to begin considering this item for champions like Syndra, or Victor, or even Teemo. It does rely heavily on getting an Infinity Edge, but that's okay, though it does mean you won't always be able to run this item. It may be a flop and not have a place in the meta, but with how popular Sorcerer builds are, it's at least worth considering. Alright, we're into our top 3, and coming in at number 3 is Red Buff. Oh boy, Red Buff. It's been a core item for blasters for quite some time, but it's fallen in and out of favor throughout set 3. For a while it was considered overpowered, then it was just okay, then after a nerf it would nearly died, and then it became just a core item on Jinx. While it didn't get a buff in 1013, the 2 traits that utilize it best did: Blaster and Battlecast. Battlecast, and in particular Kog'Maw, may become hugely important for the early game after the buffs in 1013. So if you're running those, why not make a red buff? And then it also transfers over to other champions later on, and of course, Jinx is at the top of that list. There's even the possibility that 4 Blasters makes a return, and having red buff is essential in that case. Overall, we know red buff can be a good item. This is merely meant to highlight the potential use of it early game with Battlecast and Kog'Maw. Infinity Edge is coming in at number 2 on the list. Let's first say that Infinity Edge, while useful, is not that essential by itself. It's an item that shines when best paired with other items. In particular, we're talking about Last Whisper, and to a lesser extent, Jeweled Gauntlet. Last Whisper is likely the main reason as to why Infinity Edge has remained a staple item overall, because of how well they pair together, especially after the change that made Infinity Edge cause criticals to happen 100% of the time. We talked about Jeweled Gauntlet earlier as well, so it's worth reiterating that Jeweled Gauntlet IE may be good to play for in 1013. Most likely the best way to utilize Infinity Edge though will be with a Last Whisper. And that's also why it's in second on this list, because the priority of items when you have a glove should be Last Whisper first, then Infinity Edge. We're sure this isn't a surprise at all, but the number 1 item on today's list is Last Whisper. Seeing as we just spent a lot of time hyping it up and talking about Infinity Edge, it's an easy choice to put Last Whisper in the number 1 spot. The usefulness of this item does hinge on other players having Vanguard heavy front lines, but considering how good Vanguard is, it's likely you'll always get some value from making a Last Whisper. Even with 4 Vanguard, 4 Mystic not being as common, it's still an item that you'll want to have in most attack damage carries such as Vayne, Jhin, Aurelia, and Jinx. All in all, you can make a Last Whisper almost every game and you're gonna get a lot of value from it. Sure, it may limit you to attack damage focused carries, but with so many being viable in the meta, that's completely fine. That's gonna be it for our top 10 items to try in patch 1013. But before we're done with the video, we have one last item to talk about in our honorable mentions. You may have noticed that the top 10 list didn't have any spatula items on it. The main reason for that is, well, it's not reliable to get a spatula and they're more niche than anything a lot of the time. So that's why for today's honorable mention, we want to highlight a spatula item that we think is a good one to consider when you get the chance to make it. That item is the Battlecast Armor. We could have talked about making a champion an Infiltrator, or Rebel, or even a Protector, but those are already common uses of the spatula. Instead, we want to talk about the Battlecast spatula item because of the buffs it received in 10.13. While it's likely that 6 or more Battlecasts won't be a viable strategy in the meta, it's at least worth trying out using the item on different champions. In particular, we're talking about Aurelian Soul. With his fighters, it may actually be a viable option to turn him into a Battlecast and make the trait actually useful late game. Whichever champion you want to try it on, it's totally fine just to experiment and see whether it works or doesn't. Alright, that's all we have for you today, folks. We hope this top 10 list of items to try out in the new meta will help your ranked climb. Let us know in the comment section below if there's any items you think should have been on the list. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.